All right, welcome back to the Contrarians. This is a bit of a special episode here. You know, over on the Contrarians Patreon, we often talk about other things we do out there, and people know that I do these gold mine top 20 lists, usually, 4 a month kind of thing in that sort of range. They're on all sorts of different topics, and one of the ones that went up recently, what did I call this thing? Top 20 bands improved by new drummers. And of course, here at the Contrarians, we have an excellent drum expert. Peter's a lifelong drummer and singer, rudiments, everything. He knows a lot about drumming. He's always has really good things to say about drumming. So, he's going to take issue with some of the things in this list. He's got his own kind of breakdown of it. But just to give a little bit of a background, so you can go see this list that I did over at Goldmine. So again, it's called Top 20 Bands Improved by Drummers. I'm not going to read everything off of this entire article, but I just wanted to give mine. Just go through the list in reverse order, and then Peter's going to look at some of this, agree, disagree with some of it. But so number 20, I went Todd Latour, then Vinnie Appice, then Ringo Starr, then Topper Headon, then Chad Wackerman. Up to 15, we've got Nigel Glockler, Gary McCracken from Max Webster, Ian Pace is next at 13, Bill Bruford, Dave Grohl at 11, into the top 10, Phil Collins, Kenny Aronoff, Cozy Powell, Nico McBrain, Gavin Harrison, Scott Travis, Eric Carr, Charlie Watts at number 3, Keith Moon at number 2, and at number 1, Neil Peart for drummers, bands most improved by their drummer sort of thing. So those are mine in raising intensity levels. So let's turn it over to Peter, and he can let us know where I was right and where I was wrong.
Well, thank you so much. Let me just start out saying the right and wrong is clearly subjective, Martin. We have what we love, and we dislike what we dislike. But I had some things that I would like to submit to the court for consideration here. When I broke down the list, there were some of these that I'll just concede that I really didn't have any issues with at all. So we'll just take some of these right off the list. Neil, obvious. It was just so simple. I thought Ian Pace's contribution to Whitesnake was outstanding. That's hard for me to dispute. Phil Collins, holy smokes. Aronoff, when he joined, he kind of took the role that Weinberg had done with Springsteen. Super solid. And I thought Bruford and Gavin Harrison's contributions, again, were kind of, no-brainers to me. I would agree with those. There were a couple drummers on here I'm not familiar with. I'm not a Clash or Saxon fan, so those I won't comment on them because I don't have the knowledge. So, but I did think there were some that probably didn't need to be or shouldn't be on the list. We'll start with those, and then we'll start talking about the ones where maybe I'm a little contrarian here. I'll lump them all together. Ringo, Charlie, Keith. They were kind of there pre-fame, they're kind of there from the very beginning. And for me, I kind of just, they were successful when they were there from the beginning. So, Todd Latour, I love how you said it's kind of the trick question, kind of a stretch. Todd's a brilliant musician, stunning drummer. He played on The Verdict, but he doesn't play live. But his drumming on his solo record, Rejoice in the Suffering, is exceptionally great. Obviously his singing is really, really outstanding. So let's get to the kind of the meat and potatoes here, and let's kind of start. And I broke some of them down. I said, well, let's start with Eric Carr. When we say improvement, of course, as you do mention, it's kind of a wide target. There's it can mean a lot of different things. Is it sales? Is it energy from how the band is writing? Is it material? Is it the combination of both? Well, one thing I want to just point out right off the bat, Eric Carr in his tenure was on 7 records, and Peter Criss was basically on 6 studio albums. Based on current accreditations, KISS is at 5.5 million with Peter, and 4.5 with Eric Carr. So there's really not a big drop off here as far as sales. And let's talk about their drumming styles, because holy smokes, they couldn't be more different. Yeah. Obviously, Peter was more of a jazz player. He came from that background. He's got a much lighter feel or drive to his playing. It's very unique to his. Eric Carr comes in and he's a more eighth note player. He's more heavy from the foundation up. He comes from the bass drum up through the snare. If we want to say it's more from the Bonham school, if that's how we want to categorize it. So right off the bat, once we get past Elder, because I think that one's kind of the anomaly and the material really didn't help anything. But as soon as we get to Creatures, we find out here's this driving kind of powerful drummer. And I draw a strong distinction here, Martin, on a lot of these between studio and live, because these are live bands. In the studio, I don't think there's much to dispute of how Eric contributed. And we can always talk about the chicken and the egg. Was it the material and then he played to the material, or is it because he has a certain playing style, does the material then get written to help accommodate what he brings to the table? I think in some cases, it's always a combination of both. When you've got a drummer like him, who now we've got double bass going on here. He's got a much heavier tom sound. He's a busier drummer than what Peter was. So from the studio record standpoint, no issue. I thought he was very solid, but I really have an issue with him live. And for several reasons. And this is going to be kind of a common thread here. And the problem when you replace somebody, and it's true with a singer or a guitarist or anybody else, is you're great on the material of which you are a part of, that you record and you contribute to. But if the band's got a back catalog, you have to deal with what came before you. And here's where I have the biggest problem, because live, I thought Eric's drumming was a bit frantic, a little bit over the top. Now, whoever was deciding the tempos, and if it was, Gene or Paul, shame on them. And if it's Eric, double shame, because they're way too fast. Everything has lost its feel. There's no groove to it. When Detroit Rock City sounds like a thrash tune, it's too fast. It's got no feel. So, I really don't like what he contributed from that standpoint. So it made it difficult when I would see him live when the older material came on, because it just didn't feel good. And that's kind of difficult to put up with. And we all know that no two musicians are the same, but drummers more specifically, because we all have individual heartbeats, feels, styles, and no two drummers are ever going to be the same. But, I thought that especially live, his solos were kind of just nothing but double bass flurries. I didn't think they were all that creative. So yes, from a studio standpoint, I did think he contributed and helped give them some energy, and they certainly sounded more modern. But I had a real difficulty with them live, so that's kind of where I was with Eric, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So basically, you're saying he goes down the list, he may fall right off the list, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So let's talk about Vinnie Appice.
Okay.
And you and I have had shows where Vinnie has been the drummer on the albums or the situations we've talked about, and I love Vinnie Appice. But I'm going to do the same thing that I just said with Eric. When he joined Sabbath, I really have mixed feelings, because I'm going to sound like a hypocrite here, because to the Dio era, Mob Rules is my favorite of the bunch. But just as I didn't care for Ronnie singing Ozzy's material, I didn't think Vinnie's drumming fit Bill's material. Obviously, moving forward with Dio, he wasn't a replacement. He was spectacular. And any Sabbath stuff that they had done since then, from Mob Rules through, he's been great. I don't know. I don't know if I really feel like it was an improvement. Bill Ward is so unique. He's so special in how he plays that the longer you've been listening to him, the more difficult it is to hear somebody else play their material. And we've got a long history of drummers here. So it's not just Vinnie, Cozy, Bobby, Tommy Cluflutus. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Nobody sounded right playing that early Ozzy Sabbath stuff. It just didn't work. Now, if we're strictly talking about live, that's kind of a special niche, but he did have a drive and does have a drive. I mean, he's still great. That Mob Rules kind of picked up a little bit in energy. Dehumanizer, I thought was strong. And I loved The Devil You Know. And I thought that was great. And then so I don't know, and I felt, that maybe you were slightly conflicted, the Vinnie Bill thing. That's a hard one. So I kind of struggle with that one, if that one makes sense.
Yeah, my point with that one, I think you're right. I totally struggled, and I love Bill to death. And yeah, it was a case. So number one, I don't have a problem with Vinnie on the early stuff. I love that Live Evil album. I think it's,
I do too.
I love the drumming on it. And I just like his style, period. It's he managed to have his own sound, and yet he's not completely it doesn't come up from a place of technicality and doodads. It comes from a place of rapid fire snare fills and starting the fill, before the, other people would, and just this rock solid. So it was more like a, he's brought this stadium rock power to the band kind of thing. So I don't know. It's almost like it put them in better shape physically or something. I
think that's, I don't think that's much to dispute. Bill was rather fragile. Vinnie came in with an energy that he still has to this day, that just, and I think the thing that I do love about Vinnie that he does contribute is that, he cares about his sound a lot. Mm-hmm. He's got what I call that beautiful balance between the snare drum and the bass drum, that real high crack with a real tight, powerful low end. And I've said Vinnie kind of plays lead bass drum. Yeah. Everything is from the feet up. Yeah. And he plays much less busy on his rides, and there's not a lot of washing and stuff with everything is underneath. And I think that does help really make that music drive.
Nice.
So anyways, that one's a tough one. His material that he'd done, great. Early stuff I kind of struggle with. Let's get to one that's not conflicted for me. Let's talk Scott Travis. Okay. I will just say categorically, he is my least favorite drummer in the entire Priest canon since Sad Wings. I think he's the wrong drummer, and I don't care for anything that he's done since he joined. That one's pretty, that one is clear to me. I have lots of issues with Scott. I think he overplays his double bass drums. I think there's too much of it. I don't care for his sound. I think his toms are horrible. They all sound exactly the same pitch. He'll run around the kit and they just sound exactly alike. The material that they have written since then, since he joined, I don't feel is inspired. To me, it kind of flatlined. There was great variety in the material beforehand. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with Eric Carr. There are 7 albums from Painkiller through Firepower and 6 albums that Dave Holland was on from British Steel through Ram It Down. Okay. 6 million copies during Holland's 1.1 million combined total on Painkiller. Now, we can talk about differences and trends in this kind of thing, but from an improvement standpoint, didn't help him commercially. Yeah. It was not making a difference and not making them more popular or all of a sudden put them in a different category. In fact, their sales have dropped substantially. Now, is that Scott Travis's fault? No, not entirely. It's again, that chicken and the egg. We're talking material, timing, production, and everything else that goes along with it. But the problem I have with Scott is that he has a very, what I call linear feel. He plays straight, very straight. If you were to measure it on a line, Dave Holland, while maybe not as technically advanced, has much more of that Bonham lilt to it. And I look at the songs specifically, Living After Midnight, Metal Gods, Turbo Lover, Grinder, Heading Out to the Highway, all of these that are very straightforward. I've never been comfortable with the way Travis plays them. They just sound boxy. And I don't have that it's goo ga goo goo ga. And it just never works for me. If he's gonna do Painkiller, awesome, great. But to me, I think Holland was wildly underrated. And I do appreciate your comment, and you can't deny the fact that we get to ram it down. And they used what they used, but there are live tracks and live recordings of the Ram It Down tour, and Dave's playing live. He's killing it. And so, I mean, why they chose to do it the way they did on the record is a mystery. But he could still do it. And he certainly slammed them out live, and they sounded really, really great. So nice. It was my personal wish, and it never happened, that when Rob rejoined the band, I had secretly hoped that he would grab Bobby Drazam back and bring him with him to Priest, because his work in Halford is spectacular. And if I could have my one choice, I'd bring Bobby, because Bobby was the perfect blend between Holland, Simon Phillips, and Les Binks. He could do it all. His fills were great. Everything was perfect, but I didn't get my wish. So that's why I listened to Halford instead of that Priest material.
Yeah. Nice. Okay.
Let's go to Frank Zappa. And this one is more of a perception thing for me. First of all, Chad is a brilliant drummer. Absolutely stunning. But for me and the drummers that I've hung out with and other musicians, if you have a list of Terry and Vinnie and Chad, and you say, well, you know, what do you think of Zappa's drummers? Terry is, if you've got 10 people, Terry's probably mentioned 7 times, Vinnie 2 or 3, and then maybe Chad. It doesn't diminish his playing. Oh my goodness, he's such a great, great player. To me, this was more about impact, and I kind of felt more at this point that Prime Zappa had kind of already passed, and Terry had kind of set the bar. I mean, we can't leave out Ralph Humphreys either, and you know, there's some other great drummers, Ainsley Dunbar and some others that have been there. But to me, you know, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Zappa is Terry, and how he just took them from a place of, and it's not a legitimacy, but you know, he had so much power, he had so much drive, and he was able to bring something to Zappa in this very unorthodox, very odd music. And let's be honest about it, it was odd, especially against the commercial backgrounds.
Peter, if you were going to describe, like, do you think Terry has a sound or Vinnie has a sound?
Terry clearly does. I don't think.
So what is it? What are the components of it?
It's a lot of flourishes, a lot of double-handed flamming toms, roundhouse fills. He accentuates and accents a ton, very musically, both vocally and instrumentally, where if there's a rhythmic punch in almost like a big band drummer in a sense, where he'll find a riff or a motif and he'll accent it, or he'll find something over here. Very independent, a lot of heavy double bass, but so much chops. Vinnie is probably the better overall rounded drummer than Terry is. He can certainly go into different fields. Obviously, his work with Sting, and he does a million sessions. He can play anything. Less distinguished from a sound or a playing standpoint. You look and see, oh, it's Vinnie. You know, Terry sounds like Terry, and there's just kind of no mistaking it. And he took that into Missing Persons. He took it into UK. He took it with Jeff Beck. He took it into, all of these things. You're like, oh, that's Terry. Even playing with the Brecker brothers on Heavy Metal Bebop. And, it's him. And it just really sounds, and I kind of associate that with Zappa.
And how would you describe Chad's sound?
Fluid, very clean. It's precision. It's very tasty. He's more restrained than Terry. Terry's kind of just wild, but in a brilliant way. Chad, I don't think you would be able to pick him out of 10 drummers sonically. If you've got 10 really good sounding drummers, I don't think I would be able to pick out him. And maybe that's my own failure of not listening to as much as I did clearly with Terry. So I could admit that standpoint. But I mean, he's a musician's musician. Chad is a brilliant player. But I look at the influences too, how so many players go, oh, I heard Terry was Zappa. Terry was Zappa. I heard Terry was Zappa. Guys from Charlie Benante on to, Thomas Lang and all these guys who go, yeah, we heard Terry with Bozio and it changed everything. So I think, Terry, I would probably move to the top of the Zappa list.
Yeah, Terry with UK was the greatest drum solo I've ever seen. But I would almost describe Chad as the complete opposite of what you just said. I mean, I find him like comedic and clunky and doodaddy, right? With a lot of high end, like a lot of toppy, weird sounds.
No, that's true.
He's like, he's jittery to me,
Oh, well, I think maybe that's one of the cases where I think the material that he's playing maybe calls for that.
Okay.
Because I've certainly heard other things that Chad has done, and he's so fluid, and just so musical is the term I use. So if they've all got such chops. I mean, good grief, we're talking 3 drummers who are at the 1%, skill wise. They all had great sound. They were all just independence and chops and musicality, and so maybe that's you can't disagree with Chad, but I kind of felt that maybe Terry was probably the one who would be at the top of the Zappa list.
Okay,
if I was to look at it that way. Let's talk Cozy Powell, Martin.
Okay.
Clearly you have some issues with Cozy.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Again, people's preferences will never be challenged by me because they're people's opinions and they are beyond, dispute. But it doesn't mean I have to agree with it. There are some really good and some really bad things about Cozy Powell.
Okay.
I will admit that. He is kind of a disruptor. He comes into a band, and we can go all the way back to Beck, and sometimes it's not his fault, and a lot of times it is. He's there for a year or two. They do an album and a tour and an album. He's gone. Joins a new band. He's there for an album or a tour. He's gone. He doesn't have a home. He doesn't get to work into a routine with a band, and that's always been a knock on him, that he doesn't find a home. He's restless. He gets antsy. He's like, if I got a personality problem with this guy, screw it. I'm out of here. That's not a good character to me. That's not a good team player. That's not somebody who you want in your camp to say, come on, let's go into battle. And he's like, the first signs of trouble. He's like, screw it. I'm out of here. Okay. His sound is very unique. It's him. You always know it's him because it's kind of always out of balance. It's a ton of bass drum and a lot of snare.
Cymbals.
A lot of China on his right. He hits that thing more than anybody I've ever seen hit a China cymbal. He spends more time on his ride than he does his hi-hats.
Okay.
Did he improve Jeff Beck? No. Beck Ola was already gold before he joined. Did he improve Schenker? Hard to that one's a tough one. Do I
He's
love
coming
the
in after
material
Simon
better?
Phillips, right? So did he really improve? I mean, was that record better? I would say no. Was the drumming better? I would say no.
Here is, I'll get back to this one in a second. Rainbow, you're a big fan of Down to Earth. Did you like his drumming specifically on Down to Earth?
Yes, better than even on Rising. But I mean, he improves Rainbow according to this Goldmine article because he's coming in after the first album onto Rising, right?
Right. Right. But there's a clear drop off in his sonics, especially to Long Live Rock and Roll. The drums are muddy. They're dead. They don't have any life. Now, do we want to blame Martin? Do we want to blame the studio? Or at the end of the day, does Cozy give a crap about what his drums really sound like? I'm not sure. I don't get the sense that he's this guy who sits and tweaks and he's like, oh, let me really make sure. He's like, are the bass drums loud? Is the snare drum cracking? I'm good. I don't get the sense he's like those other drummers we talked about.
Okay.
Does he improve Whitesnake?
No.
Here is a quote from Mickey Moody in 1997. He said, Cozy was a great drummer. I've always had a lot of respect for him, but he just didn't have any feel for the old Whitesnake material. Do I love Slide It In? Oh my God, yes, I do. And I really love the UK one way over the US one. I think his drums are the maybe best sounding of anything he's done. They sound in your face, and his playing is brilliant. I absolutely love it. But here's another one and done. He's not on. Obviously, there were problems with David. He's not on 87, so he's long gone. Yeah. So there's a problem there. What does he do with Gary Moore? Well, Gary had Wild Frontier before he's there. He comes in on after the war. And even Peter Collins is there, who's always gotten a really good drum sound. And I think the drums are kind of nasty. And I don't think his playing is all that great. Yeah. You're saying, well, Peter, you sound like you're supporting Martin. Well, yes and no. We get to Sabbath, and here's where we're going to completely disagree. We get to Headless Cross, and I am just in absolute cozy heaven. I am just happy as can be. I love every second of everything he's done on Headless, Tear, and not so much on Forbidden. The material's not that great, but those two, and I'm like, man, if you could have had that in-your-face drum sound on any of these other projects or things you had done, holy smokes. They would have just gone to whole new levels because the energy would have been bigger, the sonics would have been bigger, the whole palette would have been bigger. Is he using a different kind of sound? Yeah, he's got a lot of noise gating, especially on the snares. Headless Cross, it's cut. Yeah, I mean, they're all cutting off, but they're powerful and they're heavy. And of course, when you get to be the producer, you get to decide how forward your drums are, So that's kind of good. Material notwithstanding, if you like the material or you don't like the material, but I love what he did there. And I love just playing on Brian May's Back to the Light. But then I draw the distinction, as we said, with Eric Carr and everything else. Live, in my opinion, Cozy's just untouchable. He's so solid and so huge. And you don't like the jams. I respect that completely. On stage, he's just a freight train. His driving on Kill the King and his playing on 16th Century and everything is just so in your face. And that's what I loved about him. And I probably way more gravitated. And the Schenker's a perfect example. I listened to One Night at Budokan almost exclusively over the studio material. because his drums are massive.
Hmm.
And they sound weak on the MSG album. The material's awesome, but it just has no bite. There's no drive to it. So, I have a problem with a lot of his things, but in the end, what is really there, because if we'd had good sound on a lot of these others, his performances would have certainly been elevated in my opinion, and it really would have made the albums higher up and stronger, in my opinion.
Let me ask you about two knocks on him and let me see what you think. I mean, I consider him kind of ham-fisted and also consider him not very imaginative. What do you think of that?
He has a toolbox of about 3 fills.
Yeah.
He does what we call the quad. He'll do that forever. And then he'll do the and he'll do that. And then he'll do the roundhouse. And then that's it.
Okay.
Occasionally he'll do the hi-hat chokes, excuse me, where he'll do some accents like the beginning of, Stargazer. Or in default, he'll go to his double bass shuffle, and he'll do that forever. And his drum solos are pretty boring. They're pretty boring. Now, if you add Tchaikovsky or Holst to your background with some cool lights and some fog, okay, maybe to the audience, it kind of looks like, wow, this is pretty cool. Yeah. But when all he's doing is crashing and moving around his kit, while 1812 is going off, how really great is that?
Yeah.
Yes, he's exceptionally heavy-fisted. Part of that is the fact that he's playing with bloody, stupid tree trunks for drumsticks that are about that thick. Cozy Pop. Ian Pace said he could barely pick one up. And he's like, how do you play with this? He gave Cozy his stick and he goes, I can't even feel it in my hand. It's so tiny. Yeah. So from that standpoint, it's going to be restrictive because you're not going to get any speed because you can't. It's weight and it's gravity, and he is very heavy-fisted. And I do want to point this out, and I think this is super ironic. Unlike Scott Travis, who every show they've been doing the song Painkiller since the album came out, does his famous intro, and people wait for it, and they're excited about it, and they love it. And I think it's a great drum intro. Stargazer is this infamous drum intro. They go, oh, Stargazer, the greatest drum intro. To my research, all the bootlegs I have heard I have never once heard him play that intro before the song Stargazer. I've never heard it live, not once. So it's this great drum intro that they've never used. And I think that's ridiculous. Because most of the time, especially with Rainbow, he would come out of the keyboard solo. He'd do a roll, kicks with the bass drum, wouldn't even do it. And I think that's just a travesty. The only guy I heard do it was Simon Wright when Dio would do it. So that's wrong.
Yeah.
that's wrong.
Yeah.
So there's a lot about Cozy that I think can certainly turn people off. But I'm gonna love the guy, and I'll defend him. Do you have any follow up on Cozy?
Not really. I mean, I'm just always struck by how as I go look around for great drum parts, I just can't find them with Cozy. So I almost feel like asking you the same thing if I'm ever going to get into a big argument about Gary Moore, is like, show me the great Cozy drum parts, because my favorites are the Stargazer intro and the Lost in Hollywood intro.
Right.
But other than that, I mean, nothing much sticks in my head. I really like the intro to Kill the King as well. I think he actually shows some groove. In that
and
intro.
it's done in a compositional context because Recchia is driving the riff and he's filling in. When he's left to his own vices, I think of like Heaven in Black from Headless Cross. That's a huge drum intro, but all it is and he just does that 4 times, and that there's one of his 3 fills.
Yeah.
Yes, it's heavy. Yes, it's big. It's not very creative. So he has a much more limited range of I don't want to say gimmicks, because they're not gimmicks, tools, fills. And look, Vinnie Appice's got some that he uses, but he's way more creative with it. And he breaks things up, and he, you know, a lot of times he leaves more space and that kind of thing. And he certainly isn't going to get confused for, you know, an Ian Pace or people like that who just have a much wider variety. But it's interesting. And, you know, I'm not going to hold you too much to your comment here. I mean, someone asked in our chat, you know, it's look, well, Iommi and Blackmore and Dio and Keith Emerson and all these guys go out and get Cozy Powell. What are they looking for versus what they're not getting? You know, I did think it was a fun comment, because you said I have 4% less respect for them, which I think is hilarious.
Yeah.
But he was never at a loss for work.
Yeah.
I mean, when he was done with one band, it didn't take him long for someone to go, yeah, come on.
Yeah.
And I think Iommi grabbed him, and I will agree with you that I thought Eric Singer's drumming on Eternal Idol is substantially more enjoyable. It's got a way better feel to it. I think it's just awesome.
Yeah.
But somehow, you know, Tony felt that the band needed some names. You know, and clearly there's something about Cozy that, you know, whether it's folklore now or it's just, you know, is it reputation, or does it end up really helping the band when it's all done? You know, I go to the Schenker one, and I think it's funny again, because here they are in Japan. Paul Raymond introduces Schenker first. The place goes absolutely ballistic. And he goes, that's enough. I should have saved him for last. Because Cozy was super popular in Japan. Go figure.
Yeah.
But, you know, I don't know why, but there he was. And Emerson said when he told Cozy, because Cozy didn't want to do a drum solo with the LP. He said, no, I don't want to do one. And Keith's like, you have to. You're Cozy Powell. You know, and he said when he played, it sounded like World War III. And that's one of the things about Cozy that he brings is this bombastic sound. It is loud. And he and his old buddy, John Bonham, used to see who could get banned from the most clubs for being too loud. I mean, it was a badge of honor for him. So it's interesting. But I have no issue with someone like yourself looking at what he does and going, it's not sitting well.
Yeah.
So I get it. And I do understand. I just love the guy though.
Yeah. And, you know, you wonder if some of these guys hire him because I like your comment about they're looking for a named person. So that helps.
Right.
But also you wonder if they're looking for guys who are just solid or stay out of the way. So they pay attention to me. So they don't upstage me on the record, at least. Right. And then live, it's a battle. Right. But on record, it's like, you know, I want people to pay attention to me, Tony Iommi, not the drumming. So I just want, you know, cut that fancy stuff out. And that's why I want Cozy, right?
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting because he's fun to watch. You know, a big double bass kit like that is a great addition to a stage. It looks wonderful. I mean, especially with Rainbow, with the backdrops they had and everything. I mean, the visuals on it are stunning, you know, and there's a similarity between him and Tommy Aldridge. I don't think Tommy's been doing the same drum solo since Black Oak, Arkansas. He hasn't changed one note. It's the same solo, but he's consistent.
Yeah.
He always sounds great live. We can talk about studio. It might be not so great, but he's also a perfect team player, unbelievably humble, super respectful, and man, that goes a long way for a band who can count on somebody who's not going to be a headache.
Yeah.
I got the impression that Cozy was kind of a headache.
Yeah.
And the fact that he had problems with Ronnie, he had problems with everybody. And that's not good.
Yeah.
Which is why Eric Singer had a longer career and was much more prolific, because he doesn't burn bridges. And, you know,
Right.
let's quickly talk about Nico for a second. I love Nico McBrain. But unapologetically, I still to this day have a hard time if it's not Clive. I really do. And this is a great case of what we talked about before. Nico is a flourishy player. Tommy Lee called him the octopus, because you first of all, you can't even see him, and all you see is arms. You know, he's just like, how many does he have? You know, he's a very driving player, but I also think he has a very small number of fills that he does. They're very specific, and you can almost count on them. Or, you know, there it is.
Right.
And he, even more so than Cozy, spends way more time on his ride, washing, just wash.
Accents, like, yeah, off.
Where Clive was pocket, tight, punky, plus that right hand of his on those early, especially the first two Maiden records, is so ridiculously fast. And Nico never does that. He's never done it. I can't listen to Nico play anything from the first three records. They drive me nuts. Anything he's done since, love him. I've seen him a million times. I absolutely love him. And they talk about it, you know, when Steve's like, oh, can you do this? Oh, can you do this? Can you do this while you're doing this? And he's like, oh yeah, cool. And yeah, the little flourish at the beginning where Eagles Dare, you're like, oh, what's going to happen with the band? New drummer. You're like, oh, I guess they're going to be okay. Because you're like, okay, that's pretty driving. That's pretty badass.
Yeah.
You know, and it does, they get better, but they're also writing better material. Bruce is now in the band, and I would suggest that was the way bigger improvement. The ability for Bruce to come in, because they did have Clive on Number the Beast, and that's the wheelhouse. Killers and Number the Beast for me, that's all my go-to. That's my number one and number two in their catalog. So, you know, he's fun. He's a super crazy character. Again, another monstrous kit that's fun to watch, but I don't know if he lifted them. Maybe people would say so. I'm not sure I see it that way.
I would say that he added an extra personality. He's got his own sound, which is, you know, hard to do as a drummer, except for a drummer like yourself who can really notice everybody's you know, uniqueness. But I think he has more of a signature sound than Clive did, and I think he adds. And to me, the go-to album is Peace of Mind, because I feel like the drumming is rock solid and exciting. But I mean, that band has personality in the vocalist, in the bass player, in the guitarist all together, and now in the drummer. And that's why I liked, because I think he's a big part of why that band is super famous, because they have this really signature solid drum sound that's been consistent throughout all the albums.
No, I can agree with that. I have a couple that I thought maybe could be additions. You want to run through those real
Absolutely,
quick?
Yeah.
My first one is Graham Lear. If people don't know who Graham Lear is, he started on, I discovered him on the album Storm at Sunup by Gino Vanelli. Unbelievable chops, great feel. Well, Carlos Santana heard him and grabbed him in 1977, and he joined the band, and he went through my favorite era of the band by far, the albums Moonflower, Inner Secrets, Marathon, Z-Bop, Shango. I think it's their most commercially successful period until Smooth came out all those decades later. But it's my favorite run of albums from them. I think he absolutely took the band up a tick. Heavier feel. Up until that point, in Michael Shreve, it was kind of to that point, they were more Latin focused first, even though Shreve is a solid rock drummer. This was a rock drummer who could play Latin. And I think there's a distinction. And I thought that he really, and I've missed him since he's been gone. And I love what he does. I'm going to go with Steve Smith from Journey when he replaced Ainsley Dunbar. Ainsley is another one of those guys, we won't get in the weeds here, whose drum sound is just horrible. It's always been horrible. His toms are dead as a doornail. They've got no life to them. And they sound that way on Infinity. They sound that way on Freedom at Point Zero. They sound awful. They clearly sound hideous on that Whitesnake 87. His drums are awful. Great drummer, but he does not sound good. Steve comes in. He's a little more creative, bigger drum sound. Some say too big. When your snare drum hit seems to last half the measure because you've got so much bloody reverb on it. But his solos start to get people's attention. And now he's starting to become, in the drummer world, an influence. And players like Todd Zuckerman and other ones who were listening to Journey back in 80, 81, and 82 started picking up on his playing. And they're like, wow, what is going on? Because he had the chops and he had the feel and he had everything going on, which just made Journey even just that much better.
Okay.
Myron Grombacher for Pat Benatar. When he joined and started recording on Crimes of Passion, I thought the band just really took an uptick. Not unlike Nico, what a personality. He literally must not have a spine, because you'd see him on the drum throne. He would lean back and he'd be almost parallel with the ground and then just come assault some cymbals. He'd dance around his drum kit. He'd swing on his gong stand. But none of that's any good if the guy's not a great drummer, but he's super tight, very solid, huge, heavy sound, which really, I'm sure, helped Neil Giraldo say, okay, I've got my foundation. I've got Pat up on top. Now let's go. And then all their best material started coming out after that.
And interestingly, he replaced Vinnie Appice in Derringer, right? So Vinnie goes from,
I believe he did, yeah.
Yeah, the Derringer and Sweet Evil album. And then Myron is on If I Weren't So Romantic, I'd Shoot You, and does a great job. So
yeah. And I've missed him since he was gone. He's just got a feel that, is so perfect for what they're doing. I'm going to go with Stefan Kaufman from Accept. He comes in on the I'm a Rebel album, and instantly the band gets tighter. This is a band that I really sing their praises because I just think they're just wickedly overlooked. And he's there for the run of albums from Restless to Balls to Metal Heart and Russian Roulette. And just by accident, I happened to have seen him probably a half dozen times during that period, opening for other bands. They were so tight.
Yeah.
And his speed and his power and everything was just so perfect for that band. And I love where they are now. My friend Christopher Williams is drumming his ass off with them from Nashville. But Stefan, to me, was the one who set the template. And, he's kind of the thrash guy before a lot of the other thrash guys. And he had a big sound. He was one of the first ones I heard doing triggers. You'd have that very aggressive, and you hear it much more on Metal Heart than you do on some of the other records. But I thought he really took them to a different level and made that period much more commercial for them.
I think a highlight song for him would be Metal Heart. The fills.
Oh, he's so solid.
Yeah, the solidity and just the tastiness and the craft that you hear there. That song is a great place to hear him.
Some of his fills in there are just, and he was so good at accenting and syncopation without losing feel, without losing tempo. And that's hard to do. And I just was so thrilled to always see him live. I just got two quick ones here. Tommy Price. And you're like, well, who's Tommy Price? Most people know Tommy Price if you know the song The Warrior from Scandal. And not to get in the weeds, I think that's a wickedly underrated record. I think top to bottom, that thing's a masterpiece. But that band was super tight. Well, he gets pilfered. Billy Idol hears him, steals him from the band, comes in on the Rebel Yell tour and album, and takes Billy to just a whole new stratosphere. And along with Steve Stevens, That was one of the tightest live bands I've ever seen. And it had so much power and so much energy and was so steady all through Billy's prime era. And then later he does the same thing with Joan Jett. He joins her band, and wow, live especially, they were so tight and they were so good. I think he's an underrated drummer. Very simple. He's a straightforward drummer. It's all about feel and all about groove. And I think he made a huge contribution. And it would have been nice to see what else Scandal could have done, because another record or so, another guy's gone, band's gone, done. And now most people know her as Mrs. John McEnroe, not as the singer, which is sad. My last one I have to point out, because it kind of ties in almost everybody we've talked about, and that's Tony Williams. Tony Williams joins Miles Davis in 1963 at 17 years old. Insane. And what he does in his run with Miles changes music in every form and in every genre. This was a guy who was so proficient and so technically and musically advanced. He's influenced everybody. And when I say everybody, let's go through the list. Bozio, Vinnie Caliuta, Steve Smith, Todd Sucherman. You can go on and on and on. They were all stealing from Tony Williams. And later, when he does his Lifetime with Holsworth and that crew and goes much more to the fusion side of things, it gets even bigger. His fills, Bozio has copped half a dozen and uses them all the time. And it's all Tony Williams. And this pushed Miles and took him in different ways. And all of a sudden he starts getting heavier and he starts getting electric and everything changes. And a lot of that was that push in how that group with Tony and the guys that he was with just changed everything. Now, look, Miles was already a legend by 63. I mean, Kind of Blue and everything, all that kind of stuff had already come out, but a totally different style and a totally different influence. He wasn't influencing the rock players until all of a sudden you get somebody like Tony. And now this crossover starts happening and you get the fusion world that starts to come out with all of a sudden the Gads playing with Di Meola and Alphonse Mouzon and Lenny White and all of Return to Forever and all of those. And then Mahavishnu, here comes Billy Cobham. Billy Cobham was hugely influenced by Tony Williams. And Simon Phillips the same way. We don't have Simon if we don't have Lenny White, and we don't have Billy Cobham, and we don't have Billy Cobham and Lenny White if we don't have Tony Williams. So this is a great tree that kind of all goes to this big seed that starts with a guy named Tony Williams. Okay. So I really wanted to put him in there, because you know it's him every time he's on any project.
Yeah.
Because you could just, there were 3 drummers, Art Blakey, Alvin Jones, and Tony Williams. And there are actual courses in the drumming world in the colleges where you study just their right hand, because Blakey had a unique one, Jones had a unique one, and Williams had a unique one of where they placed that jazz beat, that more specifically, where's that dotted 8th and the 16th? Where do they place it? Where do they emphasize the note? Is it on the first beat or on the after beat? Is it, and I'm getting in the weeds, but you study that because they were so unique, and you could start to hear recordings and go, oh, that's Alvin, strictly by hearing his ride cymbal. And that's really killer. Nice. So, nice. I did have just a couple that I thought really made the band worse. Okay. If I can do those real quick.
Sure, absolutely.
Simon Wright, when he joined Dio, wrong drummer in every possible way. When I saw Lock Up the Wolves, I was never more disappointed, because he just does not have the chops for it. He, like Scott Travis, plays much more linear. And you just watch him when he plays linear. He plays up and down this way, not this way. And it translates to how it sounds. I was always stunned how Ronnie kept going back to him And, you know, occasionally I dream, what would Killing the Dragon sound like with Vinnie Appice and Doug Aldridge? And I'm like, didn't get it. Matt Sorum, when he joined Guns N' Roses, I had a real problem with this because I think Steven Adler, as messed up as he is, sadly, has one of the greatest rock and roll pockets I've ever heard. His work on Appetite is amazing. It's a clinic. To me, that is shades of Charlie Watts. That is shades of Ringo. That is just, it is so groovy and so tight that those songs instantly had cred to me, whether I liked the songs or not. And I got so bloody sick of them both playing them and hearing them. Maybe most of them I don't want to hear again. But as soon as you heard Matt Sorum play Night Train or, you know, any of those, Rocket Queen, or it's just like, doesn't sound right. And Matt's a great drummer. Matt is a really great drummer, but man, they don't sound right to me. And so I'm like, you did not help what was going on. And you didn't, to me, did not make the band any better. Izzy leaving was probably the bigger blow because he was the best songwriter in the band. But when they lost Dave, Steven.
Yeah.
That was a huge blow. I have two controversial ones, perhaps. One, maybe not so much. I thought Mike Mangini was the wrong drummer for Dream Theater. And people are like, you're out of your mind. He's ridiculous. Yeah, he is. He's ridiculous. But he, in my opinion, tried way too hard. It was, I got to replicate this tom sound. I have to replicate this fill here. Oh, and watch, I can play 13 over here with 7 here, 6 in my foot and my other thing, and smoke a cigarette and have a sandwich. Too much. It's too much. And I didn't think he had just that kind of, and I'll use the analogy of Animal from the Muppets. Portnoy is Animal, kind of flaily and unpredictable and kind of crazy. And Mangini was just by the book. Square, 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 square. And to me, it just sucked kind of the life out of the band. I'm curious to see how it'll sound with Mike returning. I don't think it's going to take long for them to acclimate. But I thought that was the wrong choice. It's a hard drum seat to fill. That music is very complicated, but I think he came into it trying to be too technically correct, and it kind of came off a little lifeless. Yeah.
Nice.
And the one that bothered me the most is when Tris Imboden replaced Danny Seraphin from Chicago. Tris is a great drummer. His studio work, his stuff with Kenny Loggins is spectacular. But he can't swing. And Danny Seraphin swings like a SOB. That was his forte. He could swing. Those Chicago songs are jazz rock songs. Yeah, there's some more straightforward rock stuff, 25 or 624, but that's still swung. And if you bring in a drummer who doesn't swing, they're one of my top 3 favorite bands of all time. And look, him leaving was awful. And I just thought, this just isn't right. Danny's fills were breathtaking and they were dangerous. And you sometimes didn't know if he was going to be able to pull out of it, but he would. And it just did not work for me. And it hasn't been the same without him. And I miss him all the time.
Yeah.
And so, Danny, you are missed.
Cool.
So
cool.
I thought that was a bad mistake.
That's wicked, Peter. Well, thank you for this. This has been awesome. This has been a nice enriching of that list. And there's some great changes here that I'd probably do if I had to do it again. So that's it's been a great education for me too. But yeah, let us know in the comments below what you think of this, how you would redo a list like this. Remember, this was the top bands improved by the drummers, so that's kind of a little bit of a twist to the thing. But yeah, this has been a really cool drum clinic. It's essentially a clinic, right? So thanks again for Peter, a loyal contrarian here. You can see him on many of our panels, and those are always lots of fun too. A lot of Dark Horse panels. But until next time, go listen to some Billy Cobham. Let's say go listen to some Billy Cobham. There you go. All right.
Can't go wrong there.
Yeah. Talk to you later. Bye now.
All righty.